Here's a camellia that's been thinned out to look open and airy and delicate. This is what thinning can do for some of the shrubs in both your home garden and your Japanese garden. But let's get right to the Japanese maples. There's two kinds. There's the upright Japanese maples and the weeping or lower or cutleaf or laceleaf Japanese maples. Let's start with the upright maples. One of the most beautiful trees in the world is the upright Japanese maple, of which there are many genuses or many species, only one genus, Acer. This is my Japanese maple. It was only supposed to get up to the top of the window on the first floor. Ha! How silly was I? This is it about 23 years later, and it's eating up half the house. I can't make it smaller, and I can't make it thinner, but what I can do is lace it out so that there's kind of see-through parts, or what we call fan pruning. And this is the trunk of my Japanese maple in the winter as seen from inside. Isn't that lovely? Everything about Japanese maples is just wonderful. This is upstairs looking at my Japanese maple in the winter when the raindrops hang like diamonds on the underside of the branches. So how do you prune a Japanese upright maple? Well, you prune it a lot like other trees. But a little bit more. Mainly, we want to separate the layers. First, you take out the dead wood. That's expressed as the dotted lines here in my illustrator's illustration. And then you take off the branch that hangs too far down. And then you sort of take, not every other branch, but a branch every so often, lightening up the clusters of thick foliage. This is how you prune an individual branch, and this is also how you prune the entire tree. It's a fractile, for those of you who like these sorts of terminologies. This is the after picture of that same branch. It's just lighter and airier, and it also no longer runs into the layer beneath it. So this is a view outside my upstairs window. And there's the Japanese maple. It's kind of crowding the roof, and it's sort of oppressing my view as I sit there to answer my mail. Not that attractive. So what I did was I used my employees. I called it training, in fact, and said, go outside that little window and fan prune my Japanese maple. They did it both from the ground below and from the roof above, and they used a 3-point ladder. And this is what it looked like afterwards. Notice that you can't actually see through the Japanese maple, but you're looking at it, not having it jammed in front of the window, being an oppressive purple wall. You can see little traces of the branches, and you especially take off anything that's touching the roof or the gutters. Every plant has a pruning budget, and Japanese maples are no different. Probably 75% of your work is deadwooding. We spent absolutely no time on the concept of deadwooding, but it is the most important thing that you can do with Japanese maples or any other plant in the garden. You take out little dead twigs, dead branches, dead stubs from where you malpruned last year or that was shaded out or frozen off. And 75% of every cut I've ever made on any plant is a deadwood cut. It always makes things look better, and it does not count against the pruning budget. The pruning budget for a Japanese maple is probably about it's actually pretty big. It's like a quarter of the foliage. But 24%, this is just a guess, is true thinning cuts. The diameter of the cut is no larger than half the parent stem. I need to wait for you guys to visualize this. If you have a side branch on your Japanese maple and you need to take it off because it's interfering with foot traffic or you'd like to fan prune it, you need to know if it's too big to take off. The side branch is too big to take off when it exceeds half the diameter of the parent stem. So if you have a 4-inch stem, you can take a side branch off that's up to 2 inches in diameter, but nothing larger than that. And if you take that off, You probably want to hold off on any of the other pruning on your tree because that's pretty much the whole budget for the year. And a pruning budget really is sort of the budget for what? I don't know. Once every 2 years, once every 5 years, something like that. And when you thin out a Japanese maple or any plant, it will thicken back up. So it's really the same foliage that you're taking off every time. It's not like you can take out a third this year and another third the next year. You're always taking out the same third. Capiche? People understanding this concept? Good. And finally, 1% or less of your Japanese maple pruning will be selective heading cuts, and they will be very small in diameter. The bad news for Japanese maples and pretty much all trees except fruit trees is you cannot keep them smaller and you cannot keep them thinner. You can only take off lower limbs and thin them out. There are some people who do Japanese gardens for a living who might disagree. And only with Japanese gardens would you attempt otherwise. Here's an example of a side branch on my Japanese maple that I want to keep because it matches some lower limbs on the other side. And I do selectively head it back a couple of times every year to keep it out of the walkway. But notice these cuts are smaller than a pencil, and they're always to a side branch. Let's talk about young Japanese maples. Young maples of all sorts tend to have new growth, which is straight and skinny. It looks just like water sprouts from malpruning, but it isn't really. It's just young, exuberant growth. It's sort of the teenagers of the plant world. Very knobby knees and not too skinny to be truly attractive. And if you overthin your young Japanese maple, you're likely to get more of these straight shoots. There's nothing wrong with your tree. You just need to sit on your hands until it thickens up and adds side branches. When doing young trees, you want to do less, not more. You maybe want to take off some lower limbs that are going to interfere with foot traffic eventually, but avoid trying to thin it out to make it a fan-pruned tree too early. If you thin too much, the remaining growth energy gets pushed out through existing branches, and you get what my friend calls maple squirts. If you look closely on this tree, you'll see some of those maple squirts there on the left-hand side just come flying out. This is not because it was malpruned. This was because it was overthinned or it's just young and growing like a son of a gun. Every fiber in your body says, I need to take those off to make your tree look right. But if you do so, you will just increase the number of maple squirts and you've headed down the wrong road. It will lead to more and more bad pruning. So your job is just to sit on your hands. Given enough time, these shoots will thicken up, turn up. I promise you they will turn up, put on side branches, and become attractive limbs in your Japanese maple. And just know that not all upright Japanese maples are created the same. Some of them are very twiggy. This red bark Japanese maple tends to be more twiggy, and you shouldn't try to force it into the open shape that would be characteristic of a regular Acer palmatum. You can thin it a little bit later after it gets a little bit older, but here again, you will never achieve the exact thinned out quality of the Acer palmatum, and there's nothing wrong with that. Collar ID. This is very important with trees and actually with a fair number of the shrubs. It used to be that you were told to cut branches flush with the trunk. And here we see a slide of the different kinds of cuts. There's a stub cut on the left where you cut too far out and it dies back to a naturally occurring bulge attached to the trunk at the base of every limb called the collar. The middle is called a flush cut, which cuts off that naturally occurring bulge called the branch collar. and it's very bad. It will cause rot to enter the trunk of your tree, and that is very bad indeed. The correct way to prune is to just outside the collar. It's called a collar cut. If you don't know how to locate the collar, you probably want to investigate this more, either by reading up on it or checking out a different slideshow called tree pruning. Usually, the collar is easily visible to the naked eye. You can see the bulge, and you cut outside the bottom of the collar and also outside a little rumple of wood called the branch bark ridge up above. But sometimes you can't see the collar, it's not obvious, nor is it a standard angle. In that case, I'm afraid you have to use geometry. Personally, I was an algebra person. You may not be able to see the collar, but you will be able to see the branch bark ridge, which sort of looks like a tiny mountain range on the trunk. And then you take out your plumb bob, and angle A equals angle B, using the trunk as the center of your pup tent. And just do the best you can. People ask, should I cut a little farther out or a little too close? And we actually call it natural target pruning. You just try your best to figure out where the collar is and cut to it, but not into it.